Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You've heard me talk about ASA many times on this program. ASA is an organisation that works very hard to support and advocate on behalf of animal studies scholars, to facilitate our research, organises conferences, and tries to basically keep us in the swing. So, if you are an animal studies scholar, please think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, let's get straight into it. I've got a super exciting episode this week. I'm very, very thrilled to be joined by Professor Gary Francione. Gary is a Board of Governors Professor and Nicholas
Katzenbach
Distinguished Scholar in the School of Law at Rutgers University. Gary is also a member of faculty at UEA in Norwich. Gary is well known, no doubt, to probably every single person listening to this program. He has written extensively, and we're going to talk about his whole body of work. We're not going to be limited to a single piece of his scholarship. We're going to really think about his overall contribution. But if you happen to be somebody who perhaps hasn't come across Gary Francione's work yet, some of the publications I would suggest you immediately go and pick up and have a read of are books such as Animals, Property and the Law, Rain Without Thunder, which I think is my favourite book. I don't know if you're allowed to have
That's
favourites.
an unusual pick for favourite.
Oh, I like Rain Without Thunder. Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or Your Dog, The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation, I like that as one as well, Animal Rights, The Abolitionist Approach, and much, much more. So with great pleasure, welcome to the podcast, Gary.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Okay, what is the abolitionist approach?
The only correct way to think about animal ethics. Well, it's the position, there are 6 principles. One is that every sentient being has the right not to be used as property. The second is that we don't support welfare reform or single-issue campaigns. The third thing is veganism is a moral imperative. The fourth principle is that it applies to any sentient beings. No characteristic other than sentience is required. The fifth is that there is an inextricable relationship between human rights and animal rights. We ought not to be, we ought to respect the rights of all sentient beings, and we ought not to be using, for example, I oppose the use of sexist campaigns supposedly to promote animal interests. And the sixth principle is the principle of nonviolence. I'm violently opposed to violence. So that's it. That's it in a nutshell. But it's basic. It's basic. I mean, if I had to describe it briefly, I would say it's a theory that focuses on veganism as a moral imperative, and veganism is the sort of the normative focus of it. But that comes from a recognition that animals are not things; they're not things and resources for us to use, and that because they're not because it's immoral to treat them as resources, we ought not to be promoting their supposedly humane use as resources, things like that.
Wonderful. So you've given us a lot there at the start. I'm going to ask you a few, I guess, rudimentary questions, because my hope is that this will be also an educational tool for perhaps people who haven't done a lot of reading or thinking in the area. Mm-hmm. Why is it problematic to be a property item? Why is being a thing bad for you?
Well, because animals or property does not have inherent or intrinsic value. It has only the value that we give it. Animals are property. They have no inherent or intrinsic value. They have only external or extrinsic value, the value that we assign. Now, we may have non-human companions. I live with 6 rescued canines. I value them very highly, but they're my property. If I want, I can go home tonight, put them in the car, and take them to a kill shelter where they will be killed if no one finds if their a home is not found, or I can take them to a veterinarian and say kill my animals. This idea that people often say to me, well, my animals aren't my property, and the answer is of course they are. Everyone's animals are their property. They may choose to value them higher or lower, but that's an incident that demonstrates that they are property. It doesn't disprove that they're property. I find it remarkable that so many people who do animal studies, so many scholars who do animal studies work, do not have the slightest clue about the property problem. They don't understand it at all. Indeed, just this morning I was writing something to someone about this whole idea of animal citizenship, and we will talk about that later, I hope. But I find it remarkable that people don't really appreciate the property problem, because the citizenship approach makes no sense as long as animals are property. But we can talk about that later.
I mean, when I think about your contribution to the scholarship, Gary, many things come to mind, but in particular this debate around property and pointing out the significance of being a property item at law is one of the things that I really comes to mind immediately. Mm-hmm. Another thing I think about with your scholarship is your contribution to us thinking about different types of ways of being in the movement. So you've done a lot of work around suggesting that some types of organisations should be seen as, old welfarist, other types as new welfarist, etc. Can you talk us through a little bit about how you see the animal protection movement and the kind of different approaches or different attitudes you see?
Well, let me just say from the outset, I think the animal protection movement is the biggest impediment to recognizing that animals have moral value. I think the animal protection movement as a whole is a disaster. The classical welfarism was the view that it is all right for us to continue to use animals as long as we treat them humanely, that there's nothing wrong with animal use. And that position is still shared by some of the older groups. Most of the animal groups, or at least many of the animal groups now, are what I call new welfarist. Basically, they take the position that, at some distant point we ought to stop using animals, but the way to get to not using them is to make animal use more and more humane. That's problematic in a number of different ways. First of all, because animals are property, the standard of treatment will always be very, very low because it costs money to protect the animal interests. So animal welfare will always be very low. Secondly, I have never understood why anybody believes that making exploitation supposedly more humane, because I don't think it does get significantly more humane under the best case scenario. But I've never understood why people think that making something more humane is going to encourage people to stop doing it. All it does is make them think that there's a morally acceptable way to do the wrong thing. So it bewilders me. Now, I understand why these ideas are promoted. They're promoted because animal organizations are businesses, and I think we've got to really sort of confront that. These are businesses, and they have to keep their donor pools as broad as possible. So they basically, they try to be all things to all people, and they end up being nothing to anyone. And so they don't take any sort of hard and fast positions because they don't see the world. They always accuse me of seeing the world in a black and white way, and I accept that. Yep, there are certain things I'm absolutely black and white about. I'm absolutely black and white about child molestation, rape, genocide. Yep, there are no degrees. There are no degrees. I'm absolutely black and white about that, and I'm black and white about animal exploitation.
So we've touched on the importance of nonviolence and the importance of veganism. But hearing that response, Gary, I guess I'm prompted now to ask you, what do you see as the way forward? What should we be doing to help improve things, make the world a better place for animals?
Grassroots vegan education. Nelson Mandela said the most powerful tool in the world was education. I agree with that completely. What we need to be doing, we don't need these animal organizations. These animal organizations are reactionary, they're counterproductive. What we need is a grassroots movement of people who are promoting and engaging in creative, nonviolent, vegan advocacy and education. That's what we need. And that's what I am doing, or at least trying to do. I don't want to lead any organizations. And what I encourage people to do is, everyone's got to become a leader. We need to stop this idea that, we got to look to, this person or that person who's going to, this phenomenon that we're seeing now of these celebrity vegans is bizarre in my judgment. This is not rocket science. The basics that people need to learn are not all that complicated, but what people need to do is to engage in some basic self-education and go out and promote veganism. I actually find that it's not all that difficult to talk to people in the public, the general public, about veganism. The people who are difficult to talk to are the animal people who think that flexitarianism is okay, or that we ought to be be promoting reducitarianism. The animal people who don't buy veganism as a moral baseline, they're impossible. Other people are fine. And so, that's, I try to spend my time with non-animal people, educating them about veganism. And that doesn't mean that everybody I talk to goes vegan. It means they understand. They understand why I am taking the position I'm taking. They understand, as a matter of fact, right before I came up here, I was teaching. And as I was leaving, one of my students, because I'm teaching a general introduction to law for our undergraduate students, and I was teaching criminal law, and one of my undergraduate students asked, "Can you use deadly physical force if someone comes up and threatens your dog?" And I said, "No, you can't, because your dog is property, and so you can't use deadly physical force to protect your dog, because your dog is just a piece of property." And the student said, but my dog has emotions and feelings, and I said, "You may value your dog, but you could kill your dog yourself." And we then got into a discussion. He said, "Well, that just doesn't make any sense to me." And I said, "Let me ask you a question. Are you a vegan?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why are we having this discussion?" "Because you treat animals like things. So, the animals that you're eating, they have emotional responses, they have feelings, they have sentience. They're no different from your dog." And I said, I get a lot of aggravation from the animal people, because every time we hear about the Chinese people or the South Korean people eating dogs, I always ask, "Are you vegan?" And if the answer is no, well, then what are we talking about? What's the difference between eating a dog and eating a chicken? So I think that's what we need to do. We need to, and the abolitionist movement is resulting in people all over the world, basically educating themselves and going out and doing tabling and doing, local program, local educational things and whatnot. And it works. People have great the great response, and I don't think you need to stand there with, and I don't think it's a good idea to stand there with a mask or holding, a computer showing people gory pictures, because that encourages people to believe that, well, what we need to do is to make it better and make it more humane. And we need to sort of, the idea is not to wear a mask and be apart from society. This is something that we should try to make normal. And it's not all that radical an idea. Most people care about animals. Many people love animals. What we need to do is to get them to see that what they already believe commits them to stop eating them, wearing them, using them. And if we were able to get 10% of the population convinced of that idea, it wouldn't mean that everybody would become vegan immediately. It would mean we would change the conversation and move it away from treatment, where it is right now, because we all talk about let's do it a better way, and the answer is that's not the solution, and move towards the question of trying to justify the use, which we can't do. And that's what we need to do. We need to be having a social discussion about animal use, not animal treatment. And I believe that is possible. But the biggest problem is we have all these big groups, that we have to deal with. I mean, you're from Australia. You have Animals Australia. I mean, Animals Australia, I think, is one of the most insidious organizations on the planet. When you have Lynn White saying to people, "We don't oppose animal agriculture. We're not opposed, and we don't believe we can tell people what they can eat." Well, if you've got a social justice movement and you don't believe you can take the position that it's wrong to inflict suffering and death on the victims who are supposedly the beneficiaries of your social justice movement, you ain't got a social justice movement. It's that simple. And so when you're telling people, no, we're not opposed to animal agriculture, what you're telling them is, or if you say, well, the problem is live export, as if the animals who are killed in Australia are just, having a wonderful time. This is all confused thinking. We need to get rid of it all and focus on one thing. Veganism is a moral imperative. If you care about animals, if you don't agree that animals are resources, you go vegan. It's that simple. I can give you lots of reasons, but the idea is quite simple.
Gary, I've just come from London, and veganism seems to be, I guess I want to say air quotes, all the rage. And I'm just wondering, does that hearten you, or do you worry that perhaps, is it possible to go vegan for the wrong reasons? I worry if it might be a bit faddish. What are your views on this?
That's an interesting question. I spent a lot of time in Britain, and you're right, it's rage. I have no idea. I don't know whether it will last. That's the problem. It's like every other fad. Is this going to be sustained? I don't know. And a lot of people are doing it for health. Some people are doing it for the environment. The reality is I've never known anybody who did it for the environment who was consistent in terms of doing it, and for health. Everybody cheats, right, on health issues, and so I've never known anybody who's really consistent. I think the only way you can be a consistent vegan is you see it as an issue of justice, and you stop doing it because it's wrong, because it violates someone's fundamental rights, so you stop doing it. And so do I think that that what we're seeing right now is a fad? Probably. On the other hand, I will say this. I think as my generation gets older, which we are doing, I think there's a greater awareness that animal products are bad for you, despite the fact that all of the propaganda we've heard all of our lives is that if we don't eat animal products, we'll go blind and whatnot. But I think there's a greater recognition that animal products are threatening to health. I think that there's a greater recognition that animal agriculture is presenting a threat in terms of an environmental threat that is quite serious. And as a matter of fact, if the world went vegan, that would be the easiest thing for everybody to do, and the fastest way for us to reduce global warming in a dramatic way. If we all went vegan today, we might have a chance of surviving. If we don't, then it's anyone's guess. So, I think that all of these things are sort of coming together and to some degree reinforcing each other. But what really holds them together is the moral idea that we have no right to exploit animals. That what we're doing, we're just like bullies, and we just we engage in this. It's violence. It's wrong.
I hear great passion in your voice, and that's absolutely wonderful. I'm just wondering, do you feel optimistic, or do you ever feel despairing? Or
I don't think about it in those terms. I really don't think about it in those terms. My view is this is not a matter of winning or losing. If I knew with certainty that it wasn't going to work, I would still do exactly what I'm doing, because it's not a question of winning or losing. It's a question of, what do I do in this moment? What are my moral obligations in this moment? And I keep doing it. I never think about, is this likely to go anywhere, or should I do something else with my life or something? I never think that way. It's like, this is what I do, and this is what I will continue to do as long as I can.
Do you ever feel as though there's some sense from other academics that it's not appropriate to take a strong moral view or to have a position? Do you ever feel any pushback?
Of course I do. Yeah, of course I do. Of course I do. And, I recently wrote a review in the Journal of Value Inquiry, a review of a book on essays on pets. And one of the people in the book talks about what he does for animals, and he talks about how he teaches about animal ethics, but he doesn't take a position. And I pointed out in my review, we all take a position. I mean, the idea, this academic fantasy that you cannot be a partisan, this is a moral issue unlike other moral issues. It's not an abstract thing. This is something we're all partisans about one way or the other. And the only question is, which way are we partisans? Because our lives, our daily lives, instantiate a position about animal exploitation. I either eat them or I don't. I wear them or I don't. I mean, you either regard them as resources or you don't. And I find it comical that when I hear academics who do regard them as resources say, well, don't you think your position's a little strident? Because, and I always say, don't you think your position's a little strident? We're both partisans. You just, there's just more of you than there is of me. But we're all partisans in this. And don't kid yourself. This idea, I mean, I actually think academics ought to be ashamed of themselves. I think animal studies has failed by and large. I think most academics reject abolition. Most academics aren't vegans. So they continue to, and animal studies has become a racket like other rackets, in that, we now have these conferences where people sort of, I hate to pick on animal citizenship. It's just something I was thinking about this morning. But this idea, what does that even mean? And people are sort of, there's a lot of excitement about that. What does it mean? Can animals be citizens if they're property? If so, you need to explain that to me because I don't understand it. Or is animal citizenship something that we're going to have after we abolish the property status of animals? And what was interesting was that a couple years ago, I had a one-day conference and Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson came. And I didn't get an answer to that question. I mean, do we abolish the property status of animals and then make some animals citizens afterwards? In which case we need to understand exactly what that means. Or are we going to have animal citizens while they're still property and we're still eating them? In which case I haven't the slightest clue what that means. And the thing is, neither does anybody else. But it's generating all of this supposed scholarship. And I read some of these things and I say, I can't believe that anybody actually spends the time to write. I mean, for what purpose? What is this doing? How is this helping things? And I've yet to read, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I'm not saying this polemically. I mean, I honestly would love to read some argument about why the abolitionist position is not the right position to take. I mean, the best people can come up with is, well, animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, so therefore not killing them doesn't raise a moral question. It's only a question of suffering. So therefore it makes sense, at least in theory, to talk about reducing suffering because the use itself is not immoral because animals don't know what they're losing. So therefore, killing them doesn't really matter. I mean, that's about the best you can come up with, which is sort of, it's somewhat Singer's view and some other people, but that's about the best you can come up with. And I think that's pretty weak and basically begs the question about what self-awareness, this idea that the only sort of self-awareness that matters morally is like the human self-awareness of normal humans. I mean, that's what matters. And the thing is, well, but that itself is in my judgment, questionable and I think wrong, but it's at least questionable. And so I think academics, although I suppose it would be a similar situation if you went back and looked at academia in the United States in 1810, and you have all these people who are trying to justify slavery because they're saying, well, Africans are different from other people because they consume oxygen at a different level or whatever. You would have the same, you would have academics, basically promoting and defending human slavery, which you did have. You had academics who promoted sexism. I mean, you had people fairly late in the game who were, you had medical people who were, at the turn of the 20th century were saying that, well, if women get too much education, it siphons energy away from their uterus, and they will be unable to breed. And I mean, you had respectable academics at respectable academic institutions, promoting sexism. So, this is the way it is. I mean, academics are, most of them, I've always wondered about tenure, why we have it, because most academics don't need tenure, because most academics never do anything controversial. You're lucky. They do nothing controversial. They do nothing for which they need tenure, other than basically become very lazy, and they need protection for their jobs is what they need. But most academics don't do anything that needs tenure. I've been an academic for a long time. I can count on one hand the number of people I have known. One of the reasons why I'm in this institution at Rutgers is because when I came here, this was a place that was known for academics who were always living close to the edge in terms of the positions they took. That's still to some degree the case here, but less than it was, 30 years ago. But most academics don't ever do anything controversial.
So, Gary, for people listening, say, in suburban London or in, say, New York to this interview, what would you have them do as a result? What would you like to see them doing if they're going to do something positive for animals?
Go vegan. That's the easy. Look, this is not rocket science. If animals matter more, it's either the case that animals matter morally or they don't. If they matter at all, then we cannot use them as resources, because resource use, by definition, is you're treating them as things without inherent value. If they have moral value, then the very least that we can do is to stop using them as resources. We have to stop using them as resources, and that means we go vegan. We stop eating them, we stop wearing them, we stop using them. It's that simple. And you don't need an organization. You don't need a legislative campaign. You don't need anything complicated. You don't need anything expensive. You just stop eating them, wearing them, using them. And you know what? In 2018, that's extremely easy. I have been a vegan for 36 years. When I became a vegan, I didn't know really very much about nutrition. I didn't know very much about food or cooking. And my vegan diet was basically potato chips and soft drinks and stuff that wasn't really, I didn't have a very healthy vegan diet. But it's now very, very easy to be a vegan, even if, there are a lot of processed and prepared foods. I don't actually eat those things. They're high in salt and low in nutritional value. But, and I've actually now learned how to prepare and cook food, and I actually enjoy it. It's actually one of the things I really like as sort of a hobby. But it's an easy thing to do. It's a very, very easy thing to do. And people always say to me, "Well, but isn't it hard to be a vegan?" And I say, "Do you eat fruits? Yes. Do you eat vegetables? Yes. Do you eat beans? Do you eat grains? Do you eat nuts or seeds? Yes. I love all of those things. Good. Then just eat more of those and stop eating all of the decaying flesh, the cow mucus, and the chicken ova. It's that simple. You're already eating a lot of vegan things. You just need to eat more of them and stop eating the things which are the products of violence and the necessary products of violence. Because I think there's this tendency to believe, and this is the legacy of the animal welfare movement, which unfortunately hasn't really left us, because Singer's views, Singer, who clearly dominates the animal, Singer's views clearly dominate the animals. Singer is proposing what is, in essence, a more progressive form of animal welfare. That's really what his position is about. And he has reinforced, and the movement has now thoroughly embraced this idea that reducing suffering is the key issue. And as I always tell animal people who say, "Well, isn't reducing suffering good?" I always say, look, it's better to beat your slave 9 times a week rather than 10 times a week. But that doesn't answer the question about the morality of chattel slavery. That's what you all got to get over, is this idea that the moral issue, that you don't resolve this by saying, isn't less suffering better? The answer is, of course it is. That's an idiotic question. Of course it is. That doesn't answer the moral question about the institution of animal exploitation. And so I think we've got to people buy into this idea that if we get happy meat, or if we get eggs from free range hens, or we get milk from cows who live on happy. There is no such thing as a happy dairy. There's no such thing as there's no such thing as humane exploitation. It all involves suffering. It all involves death, and it's all wrong. And you can say, well, but aren't some of these practices don't some of these practices result in less suffering? Some of them do or may. That doesn't answer the moral question. They're still wrong. And that's what we need to sort of focus on. And we need to stop the animal movement itself is quite speciesist. I mean, we still think, many animal people still think about animal issues in ways that if humans were involved would be virulently, discriminatory, racist, sexist, heterosexist, and that's the problem.
Well, Gary, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Like quick questions. Go ahead.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Pro-animal scholarship. I read a book called Fettered Kingdoms. It was written by a guy named John Bryant, and it was given to me by someone who who thought I should become vegan. At a time, I didn't even know what I was a vegetarian because I went to a slaughterhouse. I didn't know what a vegan was. I didn't think you could live without eating animal protein. That was in the 1970s. So we've come some way from that, from there. But I read a book called Fettered Kingdoms, and I read it in October of 1982, and I have been a vegan ever since.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes. In the beginning, my role in the animal movement was I was a lawyer. I still am a lawyer. But I was representing animal groups and individuals in animal cases, and I was developing animal law, although I didn't realize I was doing that at the time. But so I was doing legal activist stuff, and my scholarship was mostly focused on intellectual property and constitutional law. I had dinner with Peter Singer and Paula Cavallari, and they were preparing a book called The Great Ape Project. And they wanted me to write a chapter, and I did, although I was very uncomfortable about it because even then, and this was like 1990, 91, even then, I was uncomfortable with this idea that great apes mattered more because they were more like us. And it sort of always struck me like, light-skinned blacks matter more because they're more like white people, dark-skinned people. And I was uncomfortable. And although I wish I wish I was never part of that book because I think that book is wrong in lots of ways. Even then, when I wrote that chapter, I expressed concern about the idea that I didn't understand really why sentience wasn't enough. But interestingly, at the time, I was very close with Tom Regan, and Tom didn't think that sentience was enough. I mean, he thought you needed preference autonomy to be subject of a life, and that was something that Tom and I disagreed about. It was one of the things Tom and I disagreed about. And so even then, I was uncomfortable. But that was the first thing I wrote, and then it started from there. But.
Well, I wonder if this is going to be a difficult question given our previous discussion. Yeah. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Tom Regan. Oh, yeah. I mean, the abolitionist approach actually started, with Tom and I were very close in the 80s, and we were both trying to figure out how to operationalize animal rights. Because it was my view as an activist animal lawyer that the movement was going in the wrong direction. That it was embracing animal welfare. That it was in the late 80s. It started with the sexism business, which has been, I think, corrosive. And it was there were a lot of people who were attracted to it who liked the idea of violence, and Tom agreed with me, and but the challenge was how do you take animal rights and operationalize it and make it into a social movement that's meaningful, and so we did that. We worked on that together, and Tom was a great influence on my life, and we worked very, very closely until, animal people can be really vicious, and as we got more and more critical of the animal movement, it's like criticizing any large conglomerate corporation type thing. Animal groups are businesses. I don't care what anybody says. They are businesses, and people got really angry with us. And And Tom decided he was not, Tom changed in the mid-90s. I just wrote an article about this. It's in Between the Species,
which I highly recommend. It was a great read.
Yeah, and it was a hard article to write because that was a tough time, when Tom and I split. But he had an enormous impact on me, and I miss him. I miss him in lots of ways. Not the least of which is I'd like to think. We had some contact before he died about something else, about an issue that wasn't sort of our disagreements in the 90s. And I think had he lived, I'd like to think we might have gotten back together again again, but it's not going to happen now.
Valet Tom Regan, yes. Yeah. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Start thinking seriously about animal rights and stop this nonsense stop trying to come up with supposedly benign ways to exploit animals. Academics are great at that. And, most animal scholarship out there is totally anti-abolitionist. And that's the problem. I mean, the problem is but it's also not very good, in my judgment, not very good. I mean, the arguments against the abolitionist position are not very good. I mean, I can really recognize a good argument even if I don't agree with it. I don't see really very many good arguments. What I see is people trying desperately to justify animal exploitation and coming up with some of the most absurd things. But because other people, it's an interesting, we're both academics, and it's sort of very interesting to me, and I suppose it is to you too, but when I look at it and I say, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating study. I wish I didn't have to undertake it, but it's a fascinating study in how intelligent people can fail to think their way out of paper bags because they have vested interests. Either they want to continue exploiting things, or in some cases they have relationships with people who they have relationships with non-vegans, so they can't think about what those people, they can't think of that conduct as immoral, so they come up with all of these justifications, and it's really quite remarkable. As a phenomenon, it's actually stunning.
So, Gary, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
We wouldn't have relationships with domesticated animals at all. We would stop producing domesticated animals. 100%. End of story. I don't believe we should eat them, wear them, and use them. But I also I live with 6 dogs. They're all abused and disabled dogs. Those are the dogs we adopt. Our most recent one is both blind and deaf. I love them. I adore them. And Anna and I think there is nobody who loves their dogs more than we do. There may be people who love them as much as we do, but nobody who loves them more. If there were 2 left on the planet and it were up to us as to whether they continued to breed so that we could have pets, the answer is not on your life. I think we should live with each other members of our own species, and we should leave animals alone. And so the best thing is we eradicate domestication, and we not have non-human relationships other than the relationship of non-interference, if that's a relationship. That's what I think. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, Gary, thank you so much. So what are you working on next?
Well, in the short term, I'm working on a chapter for a book. There was a woman named Bridget Brophy who was at Oxford in the 1960s, and she was a feminist. And but she wrote an essay in the London Times in 1965 called "The Rights of Animals," which is mind-blowing. And then she wrote an essay in a book called "Animals, Men, and Morals," which was published in 1971. And I believe that I'm writing there's a book, she's passed away a long time ago, actually, and there's a book of essays coming out in honor of her. And I'm writing a book about how that she was decades ahead of her time. And it's a perfect example of how if a woman says something, it can go totally unnoticed and let alone unappreciated. But, in many ways, what she was doing in the 60s and early 70s was far more radical. Her thinking was far more radical than what came afterward. And you know, I in this essay, which is tentatively, you know, titled "The Mother of the Animal Rights Movement." I mean, you know, we always talk about Singer as the father of the animal rights movement. Well, first of all, he doesn't believe in rights, and secondly, there were people even before Singer who were more progressive, Bridget Brophy being one of them.
Wonderful. And how can people find out more about your work?
Well, they can go to my page, abolitionistapproach.com. I have a Facebook page called Gary Francione, The Abolitionist Approach to Animal Rights. And I interact with people. To the extent I have time, I will interact with people. And there are YouTube videos of various, you know, presentations I've given. And, you know,
you're not hard to find online.
I'm not.
Sure.
You know, I made a decision a long time ago that if you want to change things, you can stay you can stay talking to other academics and, you know, and engage in you know, that enterprise, or you can reach out. And I mean, the last three, you know, I mean, I've been writing academic things, but Anna and I did 3 activist books. We did Eat Like You Care, we did Animal Rights, The Abolitionist Approach, and we did a third one. It just came out recently called Advocate for Animals, Abolitionist Vegan Handbook. And these are books which are directed towards activists. I mean, because I think, you know, I continue to write academic things. I always will write academic things. But even my academic things, I mean, are intended to I'm trying to change things. I'm not all that terribly interested in engaging in the mental masturbation that I think a lot of animal studies is. I mean, I just don't find it useful. I want to, you know, we need to stop this. You know, I want to leave you with one thought. Every year, we kill more animals than the number of humans who have existed since we crawled out of the slime. So if you take all of the humans who have existed, we kill more animals than that every single year. This is a moral crisis of gargantuan proportions. It's corroding, and it's horrible for the animals, but it's horrible for us because what it's done is it's allowed us to become insensitized to violence. So that you and I can be sitting here, and right now in Yemen, there's genocide going on, and there's violence going on all over the place, and there's the violence of poverty, there's the violence of sexism, racism, all sorts of horrible things. We've become inured to that, and part of that, not the full expert, but part of that is we celebrate and participate in oppression and violence every day of our lives, and until we get away from that, I don't think we're ever going to be able to think clearly about this other stuff.
Well, Gary, that's a very sobering thought, but important for us to have at the fore of our minds. So I thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.